Tonight, we don't just speak words, we awaken something deeper. In a world full of noise, confusion, and pressure, there is one voice we often forget to hear. The voice of guidance. Not from the outside, but from within and above.
This is not just a speech, it is a reminder that prayer is not weakness, it is direction. It is not escape, it is alignment. And right now, more than ever, we all need clarity, peace, and divine guidance.
Prayer is connection, not ritual. And when we say this, we are not speaking about religion as a routine or a habit formed by repetition, but about something far more alive, far more intimate, far more transformative than most people ever allow themselves to experience. Prayer in its purest form is not about polished words or perfect posture. It is not about memorized lines spoken in silence or loud declarations made in desperation. It is the raw, unfiltered moment where a human being stops pretending and starts connecting. Where the mask falls off and the soul finally speaks in its own language without fear of judgment, without the pressure of being understood by anyone except the one who already understands everything before it is even spoken. In a world that constantly demands performance, prayer becomes the only space where performance is unnecessary, where you do not need to impress, where you do not need to compete, where you do not need to prove worthiness before being heard. And yet, so many people carry the belief that prayer is something foremost, something reserved for specific times, specific places, specific words, when in reality, prayer is meant to be the most natural state of human connection with the divine, as natural as breathing, as instinctive as seeking light when surrounded by darkness. To understand prayer as connection is to understand that it is not confined to temples, churches, mosques, or sacred spaces built by human hands, because the true sacred space is created the moment awareness turns inward and upward at the same time. It is in the silent car ride when your mind is overwhelmed and you don't know where to go next. It is in the quiet tears that fall when no one is watching. It is in the whisper of a broken heart that cannot form structured sentences but still longs to be heard. It is in the exhaustion of a soul that has tried everything else and finally surrenders not out of defeat but out of recognition that there must be something greater guiding the chaos. Prayer as connection means there is no distance too far, no situation too broken, no mind too confused, no heart too heavy to reach that divine presence. It dissolves the illusion of separation, the belief that we are alone in our struggles, the false narrative that we must carry everything by ourselves. Because the moment you enter true prayer, you're not sending a message into emptiness. You're entering alignment with something that has been waiting for your attention all along, something that has never stopped responding even when you stopped listening. And this connection does not require eloquence, it requires honesty. The most powerful prayers are not the most beautiful ones, they are the most truthful ones. When a person says nothing but feels everything, that is prayer. When a person cannot find words but their heart is screaming, that is prayer. When someone sits in silence and allows their inner world to collapse without trying to fix it immediately, that is prayer. Because prayer is not about constructing perfection, it is about revealing reality. Many people have been taught that prayer is about asking, but they forget that it is also about listening. And listening is often the most neglected part of connection. We speak, we request, we demand, we plead, and then we leave without waiting for the response that rarely comes in words but always comes in awareness, in intuition, in timing, in the subtle shift of perception that changes how we see everything around us. Connection is not one-directional. It is not a monologue directed at the sky. It is a dialogue between the finite and the infinite, between confusion and clarity, between human limitation and divine understanding. When prayer becomes connection, life itself begins to change shape. The same problems remain, but the way we carry them transforms. The same questions may not be answered immediately, but the weight of those questions becomes lighter because we are no longer holding them alone. There is a shift from isolation to companionship, from desperation to trust, from panic to presence. And this shift is not dramatic at first. It is subtle, almost invisible, but over time it becomes the foundation of resilience that no external circumstance can easily destroy. There is something deeply powerful about realizing that connection does not depend on emotional stability. You do not need to be calm to pray. You do not need to be strong to connect. You do not need to have clarity to be heard. In fact, some of the most profound moments of connection happen in the middle of chaos, when everything feels lost and there is nothing left but honesty. Because honesty is the bridge. Honesty is the opening. Honesty is what allows the human spirit to stop resisting and start receiving. And yet modern life constantly interrupts this connection. The noise of urgency, the pressure of productivity, the addiction to distraction, all of these things slowly weaken the awareness that connection is available at any moment. People begin to believe that they must wait for the right time to pray, as if the divine is only accessible under specific conditions, when in truth the connection is always available, always open, always waiting for attention. The barrier is never distance, it is distraction. Even the simplest breath can become prayer when it is taken with awareness. Even the smallest pause between thoughts can become connection when it is recognized as sacred space. Because connection is not built by effort alone, it is revealed when effort stops resisting presence. There is a difference between trying to reach something far away and realizing it has been within reach the entire time. And in this realization, something begins to soften inside the human experience. The need to control every outcome begins to loosen. The fear of uncertainty begins to lose its grip. The urgency to fix everything immediately begins to slow down. Not because life becomes easier, but because the relationship with life becomes more anchored in trust than in panic. Prayer as connection also changes how a person sees themselves. It removes the illusion that they are disconnected fragments trying to survive alone in a chaotic world. Instead, it reveals that there is continuity, that there is belonging, that there is a deeper alignment that was never broken, only forgotten. And forgetting is not failure, it is human. But remembering, even for a moment, can change the entire direction of perception. In that remembering, even pain becomes different. Pain is no longer just suffering, it becomes communication. Confusion is no longer just failure, it becomes transition. Silence is no longer absence, it becomes invitation. And everything begins to carry meaning, not because circumstances change immediately, but because awareness expands enough to hold them differently. There is also a paradox in connection that many people overlook. The more you try to force it, the more distant it feels. But the moment you surrender the need to control it, it becomes present. This does not mean passivity, it means openness. It means allowing instead of forcing, receiving instead of demanding, trusting instead of resisting. And this is often the hardest shift for a human mind, conditioned to believe that everything must be earned through struggle. Well, connection does not operate on struggle, it operates on openness. And openness is not weakness, it is courage. It takes courage to stop controlling long enough to feel what is already there. It takes courage to sit in silence without filling it with noise. It takes courage to admit that you do not have all the answers and still believe that guidance exists. In the space of connection, prayer becomes less about changing circumstances and more about changing awareness. Because when awareness changes, everything that is experienced through it also changes. The external world may remain uncertain, but the internal world becomes anchored. And that anchoring becomes the foundation for every decision, every step, every moment of movement forward. There is a quiet strength that emerges from this type of connection. A strength that does not need validation, a strength that does not depend on outcomes, a strength that remains even when answers are delayed. It is the strength of knowing that you are not disconnected from guidance, even if you cannot see it clearly. And in that knowing, something subtle but powerful continues to unfold within the human spirit, something that cannot be fully captured in explanation, only experienced in presence. Guidance begins in surrender. And this truth is often misunderstood because surrender in the human mind is associated with defeat, with loss, with giving up control. But what we fail to realize is that surrender is not the end of strength. It is the beginning of alignment. It is the moment where resistance stops fighting reality and starts listening to it, where the illusion of control dissolves and the deeper intelligence of life is finally allowed to move through us without obstruction. Most people spend their lives trying to force clarity, trying to push their way into certainty, trying to control outcomes, as if life were a machine that responds perfectly to pressure. But life is not a machine. It is a flow. It is a movement. It is an unfolding that cannot be fully contained by human expectation. And the more we resist that flow, the more confused, anxious, and exhausted we become. Not because life is against us, but because we are standing against life itself. Surrender is the moment when we stop fighting the current and begin to trust it. Not because we understand where it is going, but because we accept that our understanding is limited. And that limitation is not a flaw, it is simply human nature. And in that acceptance, something profound happens. The noise of resistance begins to fade. And in that fading, guidance becomes audible, not as a loud external voice, but as a subtle internal clarity that was always present but previously drowned out by fear and control. So surrender is not to become passive, it is not to stop acting, it is to stop forcing. There is a difference between action that arises from clarity and action that arises from panic. And most human suffering is born from decisions made in panic, from movements made in fear, from choices made in desperation to avoid discomfort rather than to align with stress. Surrender shifts the origin of action from fear to awareness, from reaction to reflection, from urgency to understanding. When a person surrenders, they are not abandoning responsibility. They are releasing illusion. The illusion that they must carry everything alone. The illusion that they must have every answer immediately. The illusion that if they do not control every detail, everything will collapse. And yet, ironically, it is this very illusion of control that creates the collapse within the mind, long before anything external falls apart. Guidance cannot enter a closed hand. When the fist is clenched tightly around certainty, there is no space for new direction to be received. But when the hand opens, when the grip loosens, when the need to dictate every outcome softens, space is created for something greater than personal logic to enter, something that does not oppose reason but transcends it. Surrender often begins in moments of exhaustion, when a person has tried everything they know and nothing seems to work, when plans fail repeatedly, when expectations collapse one after another, when strength becomes tired of being strong, and in that exhaustion, a quiet realization emerges. Not everything can be solved by effort alone. That realization is not defeat, it is awakening. Because there are dimensions of life that cannot be accessed through force. Through openness, there are answers that do not arrive when we demand them, but when we become still enough to receive them. There are directions that cannot be seen while we are running at full speed in the opposite direction. And surrender is the moment when we finally stop running blind. It is important to understand that surrender is not resignation. Resignation says nothing will change, but surrender says, I am open to a different way. Resignation shuts down possibilities, surrender expands it. Resignation is rooted in despair, surrender is rooted in trust. One closes the door, the other opens it wider than before. When guidance begins in surrender, life stops being a constant battle of control and becomes a process of discovery. Instead of asking, how do I force this to happen? The question shifts to, what is this moment revealing? Instead of demanding immediate answers, there is willingness to sit in uncertainty without rushing to escape it. And this ability to remain present in uncertainty is one of the highest forms of inner strength. The human mind often confuses uncertainty with danger, but uncertainty is not danger, it is potential. It is a space where outcomes have not yet been decided, where multiple paths still exist, where life has not yet collapsed into a single fixed result. But fear interprets this openness as threat. And so it tries to close it quickly through control, through overthinking, through forcing premature decisions that often lead away from alignment rather than toward it. Surrender interrupts this cycle. It creates a pause between stimulus and reaction. It allows space between fear and decision. And in that space, something subtle but powerful begins to emerge. Clarity that is not manufactured by thought, but received through awareness. This clarity does not always come as a full picture. Sometimes it comes as a feeling of not this, a quiet resistance to certain paths that seem logical but feel misaligned. Sometimes it comes as a gentle pull towards something unfamiliar but strangely peaceful. Sometimes it comes as silence where confusion used to dominate, and that silence itself becomes the guidance. When a person learns to surrender, they begin to notice that not every door needs to be forced open. Some doors open only when they are not being pushed. Some paths reveal themselves only when the agency to find them disappears. And this is one of the greatest paradoxes of guidance. The more desperately it is chased, the more distant it feels. But the more quietly it is allowed, the more present it becomes. Surrender also changes the relationship with failure. What once felt like rejection begins to feel like redirection. What once felt like loss begins to feel like protection from something misaligned. This does not happen because circumstances change immediately, but because interpretation changes. And interpretation is one of the most powerful forces shaping human experience. There is a deep psychological struggle in letting go of control because control creates a false sense of safety. Even if things are not working, at least the mind feels like it is doing something. But surrender asks the mind to step back, to trust something beyond its immediate comprehension. And that can feel uncomfortable at first because it challenges the illusion that awareness is limited to thought alone. But surrender is not anti-thought, it is post-thought awareness. It is the recognition that thought is a tool, not the totality of intelligence. And when thought is no longer the only authority, space opens for intuition, for deeper perception, for guidance that does not always come in language, but in knowing. Many people mistake surrender for weakness because they equate strength with control. But true strength is not the ability to control everything. It is the ability to remain steady when everything is out of control. It is the ability to stay open when fear demands closure. It is the ability to trust when evidence is incomplete. And this kind of strength does not come from external validation, it comes from internal alignment. It comes from the realization that life is not something to be conquered, but something to be understood, experienced, and flowed with. In surrender, even waiting becomes meaningful. Waiting is no longer empty time, it becomes preparation. Delays are no longer punishments, they become protection or alignment with timing that cannot be seen from a limited perspective. And patience becomes not passive endurance, but active trust. There is also a deep emotional release that happens in surrender. The pressure to have everything figured out loosens, the anxiety of needing immediate answers softens. The internal dialogue that constantly demands certainty begins to quiet. And in that quiet, something more stable begins to form. A foundation that is not shaken by every fluctuation of circumstance. Surrender does not remove challenges, but it changes the relationship with them. Challenges stop being interruptions and start becoming instructions. Difficult moments stop being random chaos and start being signals that redirect attention towards something that needs understanding or transformation. And in this shift, life itself begins to feel less like an enemy and more like a teacher, even when the lessons are difficult, even when they arrive in unexpected forms, even when they do not make sense immediately. There is a moment in every journey where effort alone is no longer enough, where pushing forward creates more resistance than progress. And it is in that moment that surrender becomes not just helpful, but necessary. Not a surrender to failure, but surrender to guidance that operates beyond personal limitation. And in that surrender, something begins to move that was previously blocked, something begins to align that was previously scattered, something begins to reveal itself that was always present, but hidden beneath layers of control and fear